Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Lebanon Baptist Church. We're glad that you're here. Welcome to all of you that are here in the room with us, and welcome to those of you that are joining us online. I loved hearing your voices sing out here as we were singing that last part of that last worship song, and the instruments kind of got quiet and faded out a bit, and I could really hear your voices coming through so strongly. What a blessing it is to worship the Lord together and to sing His praises and to hear the people of God coming together to sing praise to the Lord this morning. Let me invite you to take your Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 5. We're going to continue in our series today, Truth Wins, getting closer to the end of this series, maybe a week or two more left in this series. But we're in Daniel chapter 5. Today, if you don't have a Bible, you'll find one in the back of the pew in front of you somewhere there nearby, and you'll find Daniel 5 on page 881 in the Pew Bible. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Daniel chapter 4, and we looked at one of the strongest negative examples of a man, King Nebuchadnezzar, being lifted up in pride, and how God humbled him in such a dramatic, unusual fashion with a mental disability and disease there he was stricken with, where he basically, for probably about 7 years, thought he was a wild animal and behaved as if he was one until he came to the realization that God was ultimately in charge and in control, and he humbled himself and he repented, and then God restored him. Well, we saw 2 weeks ago this strong example of Proverbs 16:18 that says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." I mean, Nebuchadnezzar had done a lot of good things, and he was a very powerful ruler, but he had forgotten that ultimately God was in control, and God raises up, and God takes down, and God is the one that gives that to him. And everything he had, ultimately, he had received because God had chosen to see fit to let him have that. But instead, he was walking up on his kingdom, around his kingdom one day, and he looked out over all of it, and he said, "This is Babylon I have built for my glory." And when we thought, just when you think no one could top that amount of pride, here we come to Daniel chapter 5. A couple generations later, King Belshazzar says, "Hold my sweet tea." Let's read it together. This is the sequel. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine. Maybe it wasn't sweet tea that he was saying to hold, but anyway, he drank wine in the front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the kings and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed. He became sober immediately. His thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, Your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. All right, stop here for just a second. You get a little bit of the sense of what's going on, all right? This king throws this big party, and he invites all these people to the party, and he decides, let's just kind of bring in the vessels from the temple and sort of make a little bit of a mockery of that. And you wonder, why would he do that? Why would he want to? See, they had brought back the vessels from the temple of Jerusalem, and they had put them in the temple of their false god, the god Marduk, and suddenly here he thinks, why don't we bring those things out and let's just use them and drink from them and then worship gold, silver, and all of that. Why would he do that? Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. But let me finish reading the story for you so you see what happens, and then I'll make some explanation, and we'll get really practical today. So, Daniel, verse 13, he was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I've heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretation and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be made the third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." This is Daniel's way of helping the king know you can trust. I'm not just going to make up something so I can get these rewards. I don't need any of that. You keep that. Give it to somebody else. "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father." He's going to give him a little history lesson. He's going to recap what we read about in chapter 4. It's been a couple generations now. He says, "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father in the sense of your ancestor, your predecessor, but he's a couple generations removed. He gave him greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so he dealt proudly. He was brought down from his kingly throne, his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He fed on grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, and until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven." What courage. Would to God that we would have the courage to speak truthfully with people in this way, to share the Word of God with people even when it's difficult to do so. And that's what he's doing. Imagine in this setting where he's at, and Daniel just speaks honestly and truthfully to him. He says, "You have lifted yourself up," in verse 23, "in pride against the God of heaven. And the vessels of his house you have brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold or bronze, wood, iron, stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, many, many, tekel and parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Many, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple royalty. A chain of gold was put around his neck, And a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. But that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay. Let me explain a little bit for you about what has happened, what's going on, where we are, what all of this has to do, and then we'll make some application for us today. So Daniel chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1 through 4, that dealt with the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar expanded and united the Babylonian Empire. He died, though, in 562 BC after ruling like 43 years. Everybody say, that's a long time. Some of you say, no, that's not that long. But anyway, that's a long time to rule as king. He ruled 43 years. The ensuing years of Babylonian history, though, till it was overthrown here at the very end of this chapter that we read about. So a lot happens over the course of between chapter 4 and chapter 5. There's a lot of things that happen. And those ensuing years following Nebuchadnezzar's reign, it was marked by progressive deterioration, conspiracy, and assassination. So Nebuchadnezzar's son took over and ruled for 2 years and was assassinated by his own brother-in-law. Then that guy ruled for 4 years and he died, was succeeded by his son who ruled 2 months before he was assassinated by Nabonidus. Now Nabonidus is actually the king, and I'm telling you this because this is important, okay? You may not think it's important, but just trust me, it's important, all right? Nabonidus is actually the king of Babylon at this time. You say, wait a minute, I thought Belshazzar was the king. So see, like some college student may go somewhere and go into an ancient literature course in a university somewhere, and a liberal professor will say, the Bible's not right. It says Belshazzar was king. But in none of the ancient historical extra-biblical documents is there ever this guy named Belshazzar king. What is this all about? Well, Nabonidus was the king. So he was the king of Babylon. You say, what's that all about? Then I thought this, okay, here's what it is. So Belshazzar is actually Nabonidus' son. Nabonidus rules for about 17 years, but 10 of those years, he is out from the city of Babylon expanding. He has a palace built for himself, a royal palace built for himself in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, and he basically takes on the persona of like king of Arabia, and he lets Belshazzar, his son, rule the city of Babylon, and that's what's happening here. He was a king co-ruling with his father, Nabonidus. That's why when he brought Daniel in, he said, if you can tell me what this means, you can be made third in the kingdom. If he was first, he would make him second. Okay, so it matches up just perfectly. That's just a little apologetic to help with the critics who think they know what they're talking about, but do not. Anyway, what happens is historical documents tell us that Cyrus, who was king of Medo-Persia, was moving toward Babylon. He was taking territory, land, all of that. He was conquering, and he had captured much around Babylon, even to the point that when this happens, he has his army, Cyrus has his army, the Medo-Persian army, surrounding Babylon. Belshazzar, who is in Babylon, ruling, who we've just read about, at that time, he and the people of Babylon believed their walls and their defenses would not be penetrated, could not be overtaken. Let me give you a little bit about what it was like, okay? It was totally indestructible in their minds. The outer wall surrounding the city was so thick, one writer puts it, that no battering rams or other instruments of warfare were sufficient at that time to knock it down. Then there was a second wall after that. The presence of that with fortresses and towers and bulwarks made any attempt to scale the walls a suicide mission. And so Belshazzar and his officials were convinced the Medes and the Persians, the Medo-Persian army gathered around the outside, they're not coming in. We're good. We got this. We are safe and secure. So you say, well, okay, a lot of times what militaries would do is they would surround a city like this that was walled up, and they would just prevent food and water from getting in. And they would cut it off. Well, they had actually prepared for this. Ancient historical documents indicate that while the city of Babylon was built over the river Euphrates, they had water, fresh water coming in constantly into the city. They had also amassed, in preparation for the Medo-Persian army coming against them, they had amassed 20 years' worth of food for the people inside the city walls. So they're surrounded. They think their forces are impenetrable. We got this. We got food. We got water. Y'all hang out there for a while. You're not coming in. We are safe and secure. So what does the king do? What does King Belshazzar do? Let's have a party. We are in control. Let's have a party. So they throw this big party, and that's what we read about. They throw this big party. There's a lot of things that are happening in here. You'll read about wives and concubines and all of that. No doubt it was completely filled with a lot of drinking and sexual immorality. After getting drunk, he says, you know what? Bring those vessels from, Jehovah's God. That Jehovah God guy? Bring those vessels from Jerusalem that we got in our temple somewhere. Bring them and let's just use those to have a little fun. Why does he do this? This is his way of mocking God. This is his way of saying, that God of Israel, there are prophecies that Babylon will fall. Nebuchadnezzar himself had that dream of the image, and there would be a Medo-Persian empire in there that would take over from Babylon. Isaiah actually had prophesied. God, through Isaiah, had prophesied to Babylon that in one night Babylon will fall. In one day, Babylon will fall. But Belshazzar says, no, we got our walls, we got our food, we got our water, we're safe, we're secure. In fact, just to show you how strong we think we are in ourselves, let's just mock that God's prophecy. Bring the vessels from his temple in, and let's drink and desecrate them in this very immoral way. And that's what he did. He basically was shaking his fist at God, making a mockery of him in his pride and arrogance in front of thousands. And so what happens? God in this weird way, sends a hand to appear in the room to write some, words on the wall that they can't understand or interpret. I've always wondered what that looked like. It's been a long time, but wasn't there that show called The Addams Family or something, and there was my mind is like trying to go back to there was like a hand or something. Anyway, I don't know what that looked like. Could you imagine? But just imagine, and this hand appears and writes on the wall, and none of the enchanters and the Chaldeans, none of Belshazzar's people can interpret this for him. And so Daniel is brought in, and he interprets it for him, and he basically says, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You've been weighed on the scales, the balances, and God has found you wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Basically, Daniel says to him, here's what it means. You're finished. Your time's up. And he gives him that whole history lesson, too, about Nebuchadnezzar to say, when he was lifted up in pride, this happened, and you've done the same thing. You've lifted yourself up in pride. You didn't learn from his failure. Learning from experience, somebody said, life's too short to learn from experience. It's better to learn from others' experiences. He had not learned from Nebuchadnezzar's experience. And in pride and arrogance, he lifted himself up. So what happened? Well, extra biblical ancient documents tell us this is how they got into the city that night. That night, King Cyrus and the Medo-Persian army, they diverted the water from going under the wall, the Euphrates River. They diverted the water and they went in under the wall. And the people were so surprised by it, they basically marched right into the king's palace where this was happening, and they killed King Belshazzar that night. And they took control of Babylon. Mighty Babylon fell. The proud king who attempted to make a mockery of God was finished. God's word was again proven to be sure and to be true. Okay, so most of us, all right, if we're comparing ourselves to this king, King Belshazzar, we go, yeah, we're not that proud. I mean, we think that, right? We compare ourselves to this king. We look at what he did. We look at the mockery he made and the shaking of his fist to God and the desecration of God's holy vessels. And we compare ourselves to that and we go, nah, we think we're doing pretty well. We think we're doing pretty well. If that's what pride is, we would put ourselves in the humble category. However, what I want to share practically with us is this. Again, this is another lesson on the destructiveness of pride in the human heart. Our pride doesn't show up quite like that. Okay? I don't know how many of you have, tried to desecrate holy vessels and make a mockery of God. Probably no one here has done that. Maybe somebody watching has, but I doubt it. Probably none of us have done that. We compare ourselves to this king and we go, nah, I'm pretty humble by comparison. Our pride shows up very, very differently. It's much more hidden than that, and we mask it quite well today as Christians. I'm speaking to mainly Christ followers. The same kind of pride, though, that brought about the fall of Belshazzar shows up in our lives today like this. When we profess that we believe in God, and we know with our minds, we acknowledge the fact that God is real, God exists, and one day we're going to have to give an account and stand before Him and answer to Him. One day we are going to be weighed in the balances of God's judgment. And we go, I know that day's coming. I know that God is real. I know that He exists. But we live every day practically as if that's not true. It's what Craig Rochelle called in a book several years ago, the Christian atheist. Believes God exists, but for all practical purposes lives every day of his life as if he doesn't. That's, I think, how our pride shows up. We believe God exists. We know, we believe, we say we know that He is in control, and we say we know that He is the one that's going to that we're going to have to give an account to. We're going to be judged by Him on an eternal scale. And yet every day we just go through life living one day after the other as if those two realities are not true. If we're asked about them, we go, yes, we know. But we go through life living as if we're not going to answer. This is a more subtle form of pride. We could call it practical atheism. Practical atheism. Let me just be real practical then. But practical atheism is this: saying you believe in God, but living for all practical purposes as if He doesn't exist. The underlying root to that is pride. We think that somehow we know better, or we choose differently, or we're in control. The underlying root of this is pride. Again, our pride doesn't look like that in the same way Belshazzar's does. Ours looks more like this: hidden, masked, subtle. Personal pride and practical atheism are evidenced in our lives today when we live three ways. And I'll just give them to you quickly. When we live without purpose, when we live without urgency, and when we live without priorities. We live without purpose, we live without urgency, we live without priorities. Okay, so what does that mean? We live without purpose. The number one response you get from people today when you ask them how they're doing is what? Fine or busy, right? You ask people, okay, you get beyond the fine part. Okay, you fine, okay, but tell me more. I'm busy, right? Am I wrong? Am I wrong on that? What do most people tell you they are? Busy, right? Okay, we're busy, but we don't know why we're busy. We're working hard, but we don't know what we're working hard for. Or our purpose is very short-sighted. Our purpose is very temporal. We're working hard for a paycheck. or we're working hard for things here in this life. See, personal pride, practical atheism are evidence when we go, all right, I know God is in control. My days are numbered. Our days are numbered. We have a limited amount, and we don't know how much those are. Our days are numbered, but we live without purpose. We live busy, working hard, doing things, running from here to there, and yet we have no purpose, no eternal purpose behind that. We live without purpose. We live without urgency. This is the other thing we do. We go through life each week, day in and day out, with no sense of urgency. Like we live like we think we have tomorrow. We just assume we have tomorrow. We live like we have tomorrow. We put off the most important things till tomorrow, and then we live without priorities. We focus most of our time, most of our effort, most of our energy on unimportant things in light of eternity. See, what Daniel says to Belshazzar is that God's word to him is, your days are numbered. Your days are numbered. God is the judge, and he's judging you right now, and you're not measuring up, and so your time's up. And we would all say that that's true. Our days are numbered. God knows the number of those. He's the one judging us, and one day we're going to stand before him and give an account to him for how we have lived here in light of eternity. And yet most of our days we go through them not living as if those things are true. Personal pride, practical atheism today. Now, I think one major contributor, one thing that really kind of contributes strongly to this for us today, making this a really challenging thing for us, is our addiction to distraction. One major contributor to living as practical atheists is our addiction to distraction. You know, just reading a little bit through Tony Reinke's book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. It's a great book written from a strong Christian perspective and Christian worldview. A lot of scripture in there, which is very helpful. 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. He says, we are addicted to distraction. I found that phrase something that is worthy of committing to memory, to think about and ponder. This is where we are today. We are addicted to distraction. Why do we do that? Well, most of the time our distraction today comes in the form of digital distractions, and so he's dealing mainly with that in his book. But we reach for that. Have you ever found yourself doing that, reaching for your phone or reaching for your computer to distract you from what you really ought to be doing? Yeah, have you ever thought about it long enough to realize that's what you're doing? Like I'm actually trying to put my mind somewhere else so I don't have to think about where I currently am. Why do we do that? Well, we reach for digital distraction to keep work away. That's one of the reasons we do it. A lot of times people do this. They reach for digital distraction to keep work away. Like, all right, I'm supposed to be working on this project right now, but I'm going to just get over here on Facebook for just a minute and think about something else. We reach for digital distraction to keep work away. We reach for digital distraction to keep people away. We even do that. I was reading another book, unrelated, but the guy was talking about how, have you ever noticed, you ever go and watch people, like a group of friends out together at a restaurant and like they're all there and they're on their phones, and it's just like, and the guy made the joke, and I thought this was really funny. He said, how rude would it be for you to go out to a dinner with a group of friends and pull a magazine out and start looking at it, while they're all like... But we do this. We oftentimes do this. We reach for digital distraction to keep people away. We reach for digital distraction to keep work away. We reach, here is the strongest one, we reach for digital distraction to keep thoughts of eternity away. A lot of times we reach for digital distraction to keep away more important thoughts, just to keep that out of mind so we don't have to deal with it. Distraction management, Reinke wrote in his book, distraction management is a critical skill. Think about that. Distraction management, managing our distractions. Distraction management is a critical skill for spiritual health. Anybody else struggle with your phone as a distraction or with technology? Has any of you struggled with that as a distraction in your life at all? Could I just see, is there anybody else out there like that? Okay, a few. A few. Anybody distracted right now by your phone? Not like, wait a minute, what'd you say? Wait, what? I was scrolling through IG. I lost it. Look at it like this. Reinke wrote it like this. As in every age, God calls his children to stop, study what captures their attention in this world, weigh the consequences, and fight for undistracted hearts before him. So I'm saying we live a lot of our lives today, even Christians, we live a lot of our time on earth. We live a lot of life as practical atheists. Living without purpose, living without urgency, and living without priorities. That's how pride shows up in our lives today. Saying we believe God exists, professing that we know we're going to have to give an account to him one day, and yet living for all practical purposes as if those things are not true. And distraction, digital distraction is one of the major things that keeps us from thinking about that. We don't think about deeper things in life. We don't think about standing before God. We don't think about our lost neighbor dying and going to hell one day and us never sharing the gospel with them. We don't think about those things today because we found a lot more shallow things to amuse ourselves with, so we don't have to. Tony Reinke in his book gives some diagnostic questions about your smartphone habits. I'm just going to share these quickly with you, and I think it would be helpful to take out your phone and take a screenshot of these when I put them up on the screen so that you can go back and reflect on them. This is not bad. The phone's not bad, but we let it become when it becomes a distraction for us, and we've got to learn how to manage it so it's not managing us. Okay, so here are some diagnostic questions. Does my smartphone, here are 4, and I'll give you 3 more after this. Do my smartphone habits expose an underlying addiction to untimely amusements? Okay, so what does that mean? Do your habits with your phone, does it expose that you go for amusement in times you shouldn't be? Do you ever look back and go, why did I distract myself for 5 minutes with that? Why did I reach for that? Do my smartphone habits expose an underlying addiction to untimely amusements? Do my smartphone habits reveal a compulsive desire to be seen and affirmed? Do my smartphone habits distract me from genuine communion with God? Do my smartphone habits provide an easy escape from sobered thinking about my death, the return of Christ, and eternal realities? Number 5, do my smartphone habits preoccupy me with the pursuit of worldly success? Do my smartphone habits mute the sporadic leading of God's Spirit in my life? Do my smartphone habits disengage me from the needs of the neighbors God has placed right in front of me? This is a big one. We oftentimes get so wrapped up and caught up and distracted with things going on where we can't make a difference, that we don't make a difference where we can. I'll read this paragraph quote to you. I think it's helpful for us to think through it. Our smartphones, he wrote, our smartphones amplify the most unnecessary distractions as they deaden us to the most significant and important distractions, the true needs of our families and neighbors. He wrote personally, and he said, my phone conditions me to be a passive observer. My phone can connect me to many friends, but it can also decouple me from an expectation for real life engagement. When I go into my social media streams, too often I use Facebook to insulate me from the real needs of my friends. Facebook becomes a safe and sanitized room where I can watch the ups and downs of others as an anonymous spectator with no compulsive impulse to respond. No desire to really respond and care in any meaningful way. And as I do, I become more and more blind to the flesh and blood around me. So just really practically, I would just say to you today, is this an issue that you struggle with and deal with? Are you distracted from thinking deeply about the reality that God is going to be the judge and He's going to judge us in light of eternity? Are you distracted from that? And do we take things that are good tools like this and allow it to become a major distraction and something that you may need to change and update the way that you're dealing with and interacting with this? It may be helpful for you to take all those apps off your phone that cause you to reach for it when you shouldn't be, and you ought to be paying attention to something right in front of you. So I would just encourage you, review those diagnostic questions this week. This is how I think pride evidences itself in our lives today. We're not like King Belshazzar in that way, shaking our fist at God and making a mockery of Him. The way it evidences itself in our lives today is we live as if He doesn't exist. We live day in and day out as if we're not going to answer to Him. And one of the major contributors to that is distraction. Distraction. If your phone is not the major distractor in your life, I would ask you, what is? What is? Apply the questions to that area of your life. Remember the words of God to King Belshazzar, your days are numbered. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Remember the psalmist and pray this prayer in Psalm 90, verse 12. The psalmist said, teach us, he prayed, teach us to number our days. Teach us to number our days so that we can get a heart of wisdom. I think when we as Christians want the watching world to be influenced by us to move closer to a point of trusting in Christ and believing in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and believing that all this stuff is true, and we want the watching world to see that, and we want them to look at our lives, and though our lives are not perfect, we want them to, in us, see something that would draw them to Christ. I think when we want that, if we want to live like that, we got to live like these things are true and not live as if they aren't. And when we live as if God exists, and when we live as if we're going to give an account to Him in light of eternity, when we live that way, when we number our days, knowing that they are numbered, it is a positive, influential testimony to a watching world. Father, thank you for this time together today. Lord, in every age and in every generation, in every time, there are different new things that come up that your people have to wrestle with and grapple with and have to try to evaluate their relationship in light of it and in light of you and how it impacts their ability to think about eternity and how it impacts our ability or hinders our ability to focus on what truly matters most. We have today endless things to distract us from what really matters. We have endless things to keep us from living as if you exist, because you do, and as if you're going to judge us, because you will. So, Father, I pray that you would help us to grapple with that this week, to put into place some changes, to slowly start adjusting and fighting and dealing with and really wrestling with how we're being distracted from thinking about eternity. And then as that begins to impact us, as we think sober thoughts and as we think more about what matters in the eternal, it'll change how we live. And you'll get glory through it. People will come to know Christ. We'll grow closer to you. We'll find a much sweeter experience here on this life. We'll find a much sweeter experience here in this life when we really deal in right relationship with you and we stop being so distracted from it. Rid us of our pride so that you can be glorified.